Okay, great. For those couple of people who came in a little late, could you please make sure that your municipality's name is in your name so we can match up attendance records? And I'm Jen Inglis, State Aid Specialist at MBLC. Cate is here. Cate, do you want to say hi?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cate Merlin. I'm head of the state programs unit at the MBLC. And so Jen and Weichi and Aparna and I work together to certify you all every year.
Yes. And those of you who are new will learn about certification as we go through this process.
And you'll see our names a lot and get lots of emails
Yes.
from us.
Yep. Yes, and we do a lot of training in the summers and stuff. One thing I want to just uh, let you know is that we're going to go through a number of slides. So if you have questions, just jot them down as we're going, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. We try to cover everything, so if you have a question while we're talking, it might be in a later slide. So you kind of have to just deal with Cate and I while we walk through the slides at the beginning. Let me go ahead and share that. And there are always so many things I need to do when I do this training. So I'm going to just hide this panel. Okay. I don't, having some technical difficulties. So here we go. All right. And all right. So this is the introduction to the state aid grant program. Me and Cate from the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners, MBLC. You'll hear that a lot. This is spring 2026 information. And during training today, we're going to cover an overview of the program, so get you sort of the big picture and also the history of the program a little bit. I'm going to walk through the requirements of the program, and we'll walk through the waiver process as well. And you'll learn about what a waiver is in a minute. So the State Aid to Public Libraries program is an annual voluntary grant program that distributes local aid to municipalities. The grant money is administered by the MBLC. The purpose of the State Aid to Public Libraries program is to encourage municipal support of libraries. We have standards, regulations, and laws that encourage municipalities to fund their libraries, encourages municipalities to improve their public library service. It bolsters reciprocal resource sharing. One of the key components of the state aid program is that if you are certified for state aid purposes, anyone in another community in Massachusetts who is certified can come into your library and borrow your materials. It's a very important piece. It allows people to move from place to place. It's very cool. And that's kind of the key component to it. The we're going to talk about the grants themselves, the awards, and part of it is to balance the differences in municipal funding. So we have some wealthy communities in Massachusetts and we have some not so wealthy communities in Massachusetts, and part of it tries to equalize that. There are offsets for libraries who circulate those materials to other patrons from other certified materials. So that reciprocal borrowing that I talked about, you get a small offset for that. And I will talk about that more in another slide. The funding for the program is appropriated every year by the state to the MBLC, and the legislature does that. Last year, we got $20 million, and that $20 million was dispersed to all of the libraries in the program. Last year, for the first time, or this year, all of the libraries in the state, all of the municipalities in the state who were eligible to apply are certified, and that's the first time, so that's pretty exciting for us. We are hoping that we get a teeny bump in that state aid money this year, and that money will all go to libraries, but the state budget hasn't been settled yet. Municipalities are certified by the commissioners every year, and I'll walk a little bit through that process or the dates on that later. And it's important to know that it's the municipality who is certified, not the library. And that's some language that you can use when you're talking to your officials, that the municipality is applying for state aid and the municipality is certified. A little bit of history. The state aid program started in 1890, so it's been around for a long time. It's been pretty successful. The program exists in statute and in regulation. The statute is Mass General Law 78. The regulations are the 605 section, and we have them linked from our website. And I'll send out these slides probably tomorrow to you all. And but our website has links to the law, and it's actually pretty fascinating if you have some time that you want to go through. And because this program started so long ago, there's a lot of really, kind of retro stuff in there. So with that $20 million that we get, and again, that's an annual appropriation or an annual fund that we get from the legislator. We have no idea how much it's going to be next year. It could be, very cut, so we can't say that that's what we get every year. It's broken into three parts. So you're actually getting sort of three different grants. You're getting a library incentive grant. So that's based on your population. Larger cities get more money of that pool of money than the smaller towns do. Then there's the Municipal Equalization Grant. So we've got the LIG, the MEG. The Municipal Equalization Grant is the grant that I mentioned earlier that tries to equalize services and funding. So if you're a wealthy town, you'll get a smaller part of that pool of money. And then we have a non-resident circulation offset. That is a little credit to you when someone from another municipality comes into your library and you circulate materials over the desk. And we have more information about that later. The requirements of the program are sort of in three chunks. So the first one is your municipal appropriation requirement. This is one of the most important pieces of information that you can have. Your municipalities know about it, or they should know about it. This is kind of the number that keeps libraries funded. The second chunk are minimum standards of free public library service, and there's a whole bunch of them, and I'll go into more detail in the ones that are sort of financial and you have to keep an eye on that you need to apply for. And then the third sort of requirement are the annual reports and applications. So part of the requirement for the state aid program is that you give us this information and you apply for state aid. So we'll walk through those. Oops, sorry, I clicked something. Okay. The first requirement that I'm going to walk through is the municipal appropriation requirement. This is, we call it the MAR, so you don't always have to say municipal appropriation requirement. But this is the minimum that is required by law. It's in statute. This is the minimum amount that your municipality has to appropriate to you for your funding of your library, required by statute. We figure out what that amount is by looking at your 3 prior year budgets. And when you do your math, you take an average of your 3 prior years, multiplied or increased by 2.5%. We have this information is all on our website, so you don't have to like scurry to remember it right now. But an example here is your FY24 budget, your FY25 budget, and your FY26 budget divided by 3 to get your average, and then your plus times 1.025, that's your 2.5%, will give you your MAR for FY27. We are looking at what your municipality gave you, your appropriation, or the MAR, whichever is higher. So if you are a library who is underfunded, you have to use what is required. If you get more than you need every year, you get more than that minimum requirement, that sets the standard. We include this information broken down into year categories on your application so you can know the numbers that we see. We do ask that you do your own math for your MAR so you know how it works, but Cate and I are happy to review your numbers. So, you can always just send us something and say, I did my math, does this make sense? And we will confirm for you. Now, the statute is that it's the average of the 3 prior years increased by 2.5%, but it's the 3 years that are increased. It's not, we don't expect a 2.5% increase every year. Sometimes people read it that way. It ends up being just over about 1% a year, but there can be a little bit of fluctuation and some dips as long as you're making the MAR minimum. If your total appropriated municipal income, your TAMI, so you'll want to learn that one too, that is what you get from your municipality for your July 1st fiscal year. If what you get from your town or city doesn't meet the minimum requirement, you can apply for a waiver of that requirement when you go into the state aid application process, and we'll talk more about waivers in a minute. Commissioners are looking for a local maintenance of effort. So commissioners meet monthly and in the first week of the month. In November, December, and January, they are approving libraries and municipalities for certification. Cate, Weichi, Parna, and I go through applications in the fall after you have applied. And we get as many people as we can in through the process as early as possible. And once you are certified, you'll get money within a few weeks, but that comes up a little bit later. February, the process is still continuing, and that's for when people get waivers. So it's a 4-month period of time. And the commissioners take, we'll say if you've met all of your things, it's just basically a list. All of these libraries have met all of their requirements, and then you just get certified. It's almost pro forma. Libraries who don't meet that municipal appropriation requirement go through much more scrutiny. Oops. The MAR waiver process. Cate, do you want to talk about this?
Yes, so speaking of scrutiny, if your budget for FY27 does not meet the MAR, you get to embark upon the MAR waiver process, working mostly with me. Basically, what it means is that we know that sometimes financial times are tough with your towns, especially these days. Everything's kind of coming to a head at once financially. And as long as your town is trying to fund the library but can't quite make it, then the commissioners can vote to give your town a waiver of the MAR for the year, which basically says, we know times are tough. We'll kind of let it slide this one time. We understand, but you're not getting off scot-free. They have, there's a process to go through. There's a lot of paperwork that has to be filled out and sent to us and then sent to the commissioners. And the commissioners do look at your town budgets very carefully to make sure that the library is not being unfairly targeted or singled out or cut compared to everyone else. So the original statute waiver used to allow for only 10 waivers per year. Now every year the budget language that is passed allows for unlimited waivers essentially. And I believe that started during like the 2008-2009 financial crisis. That's when that changed. So there's no concern that like the commissioner's only going to pick 10 libraries to give waivers to. Everybody can get a waiver if they deserve it essentially. I do offer special waiver training. So I had my first like 2 weeks ago, which is crazy early. Normally I start these in like August. but we know a lot of people already are learning the statuses of their FY27 budgets because thankfully a lot of towns are starting really early to plan for next year. I'm going to probably offer another one in early April. So if you think that you will need to, if there's any chance that you're going to have to go through the waiver process for FY27 that you won't meet the MAR, please email me to let us know so we can start working with you and just have an idea of what you're going through, and then look for a special waiver training coming in April. Basically, the way the waiver process works is when you apply for state aid, which is due the first Friday of October. You will also send in a waiver petition, which is saying like, yes, we know we're applying for a waiver. We'll send you the rest of the stuff in a month. It needs to be signed by you, by your trustee chair. And this year we added a signature line requirement for your town as well, because the towns are doing a lot of work for the waiver process, for the waiver application. So we want them to know ahead of time that this is coming. Then the rest of the paperwork is due the first Friday in November, and that includes, again, this will all happen. You'll learn about this if you have to go through the waiver process, but there's letters that we need from you, from the town, from your trustees. There's additional budget documentation, and there is something called the disproportionate cut worksheet, which is most important, which essentially tells us if your cut was in line with the rest of the town budget cuts or was an outlier. When I was a library director in 2020 for FY21, we had a 17% cut, but the rest of the town budget went up around 0.5%. So that's clearly disproportionate, and the library was being singled out and cut unfairly and disproportionately to the rest of the town. If that is your situation, please reach out to me. There's a whole nother process to go through and like a presentation that has to happen. Hopefully none of you are in that situation, but again, if you think you're going to need a waiver and you're not going to reach your MAR, please reach out to Jen and myself earlier rather than later so we can start talking. So the waiver applies to the current year. So there will be a waiver for FY27, even though waivers are granted in February of 2027. So everything is by the fiscal year, but really it's like bumped by 6 months because of the application process and everything. So the waiver would be for if you receive a waiver in February of 2027, that's for FY27. When you're looking at your FY28 budget, as Jen said, the future MAR calculation does have to take into account the MAR for the year that you did not reach it. Your MAR is never going to go down unless you like drop out of the program, which is a whole nother process that we don't want to talk about. Basically, your MAR keeps growing every year, and it's really important to remind your towns of that because they don't get to underfund you for a year and then everything is fine. The MAR goes down and it's easier for them. The point of this is that the MAR keeps growing because they have to keep showing that maintenance of effort. We used to allow municipalities to kind of get waivers indefinitely, which led to some really bad situations of a town being like, we can just get a waiver every year. We don't need to worry about it, right? Like we'll just underfund the library every year. It's not a big deal. We'll automatically get a waiver. And also then led to some situations like I hate to keep using Lawrence as an example, but they were on a waiver for 14 years. And then when the mayor decided it was time to have them be fully certified and not need a waiver, they had to in one fiscal year add like $250,000 to the library's budget because that MAR does keep growing. So we have the 5-year waiver plan, which is in effect now. I think this is the 5th year it's been in effect. Basically every year you can apply for a waiver and receive a waiver for 5 years. Every year there's more and more paperwork that the town has to send us to say we're trying, this is our plan, this is how we're going to get back up to the MAR within the next 5 years. And then after that 5 years, the commissioners have the right then to not grant a waiver and to decertify the community. Because at that point, they've given you 5 years to get back up to the standards and the town has not done it. Therefore, there need to be some repercussions. So decertification and disproportionate cuts. Decertification is really bad, to put it lightly. It's a really big embarrassment to a municipality because right now, as Jen mentioned, 347 of the 351 municipalities are certified, and it's all the people who, and the 4 that aren't do not apply for the program because they either have a library that's open like 2 hours a week or a month and it's not worth it to them, or they don't have a library at all. But everybody that applies is certified, and you don't want your town to be the one town that cut the library so much that the commissioners did not grant a waiver and you become decertified. That's a really big source of shame and embarrassment for a town, as it should be. Disproportionate cuts. So again, when your cut is bigger than the rest of the towns is really also kind of a mark against the town because that shows they're not it can start to show that, like the beginning of breaking down of support for the library. Again, when I was cut 17% and the rest of the town went up a 0.5%. That clearly shows that the town was not doing its best to support the library. So the bigger disproportionate cut is, the less likely the more likely the commissioners are to really drill down on your town and ask for more and more information, and the more likely it is for your commissioners to not certify your municipality. The commissioners are in the business of certifying libraries. They really want to certify everyone, but sometimes it is necessary to send a message to towns that we see what you're doing to the library budget. This is not equitable. This is not fair. This is not supporting your townspeople and your library, so they have to make a point. That doesn't happen in a long time, but it could always happen based on, we're already having discussions with libraries that are facing like 20% cuts next year, 12% cuts. So, yeah, you don't want a disproportionate cut, because that makes the waiver process more complicated, and it is more likely that decertification happens. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Jen?
Just that if you are applying for a waiver, your town has to, if and your disproportionate cut, your town has to, or municipality has to show up at the meeting and be asked questions. So
Yes.
that can sometimes be a tool. Um,
Just
oh, sure.
reaching out to us as soon as possible.
Yeah.
The waiver process is meant to be tedious, because it's meant to show the towns that, like, this is legit and this is real and we're not messing around, right? This is a real statutory state law requirement. This is not some floofy library thing. This is like, in state law, this is required if you decide to participate in this program. And Jen and I can walk you through it and talk to you, and also kind of assure you that if something bad is happening, it's not your fault. And we can walk you through things. So please reach out to us privately as soon as possible if you think that budget cuts are coming your way.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, so that was the first big chunk of the requirement, your municipal appropriation requirement. The next set this is a long list, and I'm going to just walk through it pretty quickly. These are the minimum standards of free public library service. These are in statute and regulation, so they have a very specific name. These minimum standards are designed to equalize what each community brings to the program. We have some really big cities, and we have some teeny tiny towns, and we have some teeny tiny towns that have 5 little libraries in them that are all independent. So we have such a wide variety of libraries. We want everyone to contribute in a meaningful way to the program. You have to be open to all residents of the Commonwealth. Anyone can come into your library. You can't charge for normal library services. This is stuff like books. You can't charge to lend books. You can charge for things like faxes. If you do that, you can charge for printing, you can charge for meeting room use, but you can't charge for borrowing materials. Minimum number of hours per week. This is based on your population, and the asterisks mean I'm going to go over these in more detail in the next slides. So based on your population, you are required to be a minimum number of hours and days open per week. We have director personnel requirements. So your library director has to have at least a bachelor's degree for small towns and a master's for the larger towns. We'll talk about that more. We have a materials expenditure requirement. You have to spend a certain amount of money on materials to be part of this program. You have to lend books and other materials to other libraries in the Commonwealth and certified municipalities. So those 4 towns that we were talking about that don't have libraries, or have libraries that are very small and don't qualify, you do not have to lend to them, but they have to be allowed to come into your library. And then you have to provide your non-resident borrowing report. Sorry, that skipped ahead. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So this is one of the minimum standards that I put that asterisk next. So this is your hours open per week standard. And this chart is on our website, and basically you have to see where you fall population wise. So I've worked in libraries in the B tier and in the D tier and in the G tier. So sort of all over the place. And then your minimum hours per week are here 15, including some evening hours, 25, including some evening hours. Some evening hours means a full hour after 5. So if you are open, 10 to 6, that covers that hour. If you close at 5:30, that doesn't count as an evening hour. Now, as you get to be larger population, you're required to be open more days. And then our largest, our cities and our larger towns are required to be open mornings, evenings, and afternoons and be open 6 days. We don't require it to be Saturday or Sunday. That's up to the municipality, but those bigger communities have to be open 6 days a week. This chart will look familiar because when we get to the materials requirement, we are also using the population tiers. The director personnel requirements, library directors for municipalities over 10,000 are required to have a master's degree from an ALA accredited institution. So the MLS or the MLIS or whatever it is that you have. This is mandatory. There's no wiggle on room, and it has to be upon appointment. So the day your director starts, they have to have that master's degree. They have to apply for a certificate of professional librarianship that is issued by us. We have forms on our website. So if you are a new director in Massachusetts, you'll want to get that certificate as soon as possible. I think it's like $58 or something, and you will send that paperwork to us. If you are under 10,000, your director has to have a bachelor's degree and a different additional training. There is no wiggle room on this. We've had some smaller towns try to get us to waiver on this, and we have said pushed back. No. Allowing a bachelor's degree with extra training is an accommodation to the rule that everyone should have an MLS. So we've already made accommodations for those smaller towns. Your director has to have a bachelor's degree upon appointment, and then they have 6 months to get started on their basic library techniques training. That training is offered through the Massachusetts library system, which is one of our affiliates. If you need help getting that information, we have stuff linked on our website, and you can also email me or Weichi, and we can give you that contact info. You also need to have a certificate of sub-professional librarianship, and you can apply for that. Sub-professional and professional are just the titles that are in the statute. It is not at all a reflection of how we feel about the library directors who work in smaller towns. So it's just that that's kind of the name of them. If there is a change in director, so a director resigns or retires or whatever happens there, we do have forms on our website that are required to notify us of that change. We need a change when the director leaves and when somebody else is hired. If there's a hiring process, like, somebody resigns and you're going to take 2 months to, find somebody new, or, somebody left at short notice and you haven't already started, there has to be an interim or acting director appointed. And we have forms for that as well. So if you have like a 3-month search, we need a director resignation form, an appointment form for an acting person, a resignation form for an acting person, and then the hiring of the new person. Those forms are on our website. The trustees of the library really should be in charge of this process, but they don't often know, and we're trying to get them to know that, but we're telling you all. So you can make sure you've got your forms filled out. Now we're on to the materials expenditure requirement, and you'll notice that we've got this handy dandy chart again. This time, though, it's a reverse sort of weight of it. The smaller populations of in the town, so the smaller libraries, the smaller municipalities, are required to send a higher percentage of their budget on materials. And then you'll notice that our largest cities require only 12% on materials. What you do, and actually, I'll wait till we get to the next slide. The percentage is based on your appropriation in July, and this kind of smaller libraries having a higher percentage of materials is to do part of that balancing and contribution in the program because the staffing costs of being open 63 hours versus 20 hours is significant, so it kind of flips. So your materials expenditure requirement, the funding for your requirement doesn't have to come from your operating budget. So I once worked at a library where we got $0 for materials. I had to use all of my state aid money to pay for materials to qualify for state aid. And that is still the case for some libraries across the state. Some libraries get all of their funding from their materials from their municipality. But for our purposes, your funding for materials can come from anywhere. You can be purchased by your friends through grants and gifts. If you do a grant with, a local, like, healthy living grant in your community and they give you money to buy books on exercise, you can use that to count. Gifts, fines, and fees, if you have those, you can use state aid. You can use pretty much anything to count towards that materials expenditure requirement. Non-residents from Massachusetts need to be able to borrow those materials. So if somebody comes into your library and they want to borrow one of your library of things items, you have to lend that library of things item to them in order for that expenditure to count. Books, ebooks, magazines, library of things items, museum passes, anything that counts towards, a material for a patron count, and the expense of that counts towards this requirement. So for just to give you an example, so for your requirement, well, you look at your appropriated budget. Whoops. So I clicked too hard on that. Your appropriated budget for FY27, so whatever you got on July 1st, basically. So say that is $750,000. Your population is 17,000. That tier would be 15%. So that is based on that chart I showed you earlier. You would take your $750,000 appropriation, multiply it by 0.15, and you'll get 112.5 is your materials expenditure requirement. You need to spend 112.5 on books, DVDs, ebooks. If most libraries are in a network, so your network buys ebooks on your behalf, you can count those, that amount that you spend on that. So you need to purchase materials up to that 112.5. A few years ago, when that 5-year waiver process happened, something else happened that is trying to help libraries, that you can spend up to 10% of your materials expenditure requirement on technology for direct patron use. So of that 112.5, you can spend $11,000, $11,250 for technology for direct patron use. We go over this more in training when we do our uh, reporting for the summer, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But technology for direct patron use would be things like if you buy new computers, patron computers, you can count up to $11,250 for that. It doesn't count Wi-Fi. So anything that's strictly operational, you can't count. But if it is directly for patrons to use your stuff, hotspots count as materials. Hotspots connection fees, you can count here. I don't want to go too into the weeds on that, so if you have questions, please ask us. For those of you who are new, and those of you who are not new, we usually send out a reminder in March-ish to make sure you are meeting this requirement, because you'll want to take a look at where you are and make sure you're going to hit that, because if you don't, you can't apply for state aid. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Oh, right here, we have some spaces for you.
So, one thing that we do have in our regulations that allows for lib makes things a little bit easier for some libraries. Some libraries are open way more hours than are required. For example, I'm working with a library now that is open 29 hours a week, but based on population, they're only required to be open 10 hours a week. So we offer something called flexibility. That basically means if that library it's open 10 hours, they're supposed to be open 10 hours a week, which means their materials requirement is 20%. They're open 29 hours a week, which is actually the requirement for two population tiers above them that has a 19% materials expenditure requirement. So we allow that library to apply for flexibility when they apply for state aid that says we're meeting the hours open requirements of a specific population tier that's higher than ours, so we only have to meet the materials expenditure requirement of that higher population tier. Basically, the more hours you're open, the less you have to spend on materials. Um, if you decide to do this, if you're looking at your budgets now, like for FY26 that we're in the middle of, and you're like, I'm not going to make my 20%, but I can make 19% because I'm open that same population tier's hour requirements over 25 hours, you can decide to do it during the year. It's not something that you have to get prior approval from us for. It's something that you have to kind of tell us at the end. So a lot of libraries plan for this, knowing that they're open those 29 hours. So they plan to spend the 19% materials expenditure requirement. And then in the fall, they basically let us know through a request for flexibility. It's just a simple page that says, hey, these are our official requirements. This is the requirements we're meeting of this other population tier. And they tell us in the application, and you send it in with your stated application. And then as we're going through your application, we look at it and approve it. And it's very simple, but it does allow some flexibility for libraries that do it. We can't switch it. It's not for libraries who buy, it's not for a library that's required to spend 13% on, say a library is required to spend a lower amount on materials because they're a bigger population, but they spend 20% so they can be open less hours. It doesn't work like that. It's just based on you being open more hours than is required. You can go on our website under policies and you can see the different population tiers and their requirements side by side to see if you would qualify for flexibility. And also feel free to email us and we can let you know if that would make sense for you. But a lot of libraries do build this into their budget every year. They know they're going to be open more hours than required, so they can take that little bit of a cut to their materials expenditure requirement. And it helps a lot of libraries
One
in
thing
the
I
long
want to add
run.
to that, and I'm
Yeah.
actually going to add it to the slide, is that your trustees have to approve this. They have to sign off on
Yes.
it, and not everyone will do that. I was in a library that was open 63 hours, and we were only required to be open 40. And the difference was $60,000. And I really wanted to use that difference for staffing, but they wouldn't let me because they had fought so hard for so long for the town to know that 16% was required. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna just buy some more board games, I guess. Like it was a struggle for me as a director. So you have to make sure you talk to your trustees about it, and they do have to sign off on the form. I'll go to the
Thanks,
next
Jen.
page. Sorry, I was writing stuff down, Kate.
Okay, so while the flexibility is a good thing and it helps the library, an accommodation is something that you don't have to officially apply for. It's something that the numbers will show up in your compliance form we're looking at the end of the year. But this basically allows libraries to not quite meet 100% of either their hours open and or materials expenditure requirement, but still be certified for state aid. So this is an accommodation when you can't meet those requirements. Um, so an accommodation means that a municipality can't meet 100% of their hours and or materials requirement. The accommodation allows you to still be certified by hitting 90% of those two requirements. And again, it's an automatic thing that we do on the back end. You don't have to apply for it or tell us about it or anything. 90% is really important. Back in the day, there used to be, you could go down to, I think, like 75% of their requirements and still get certified, but that was allowing a lot of towns to really cut budgets and cut hours without any pushback. So the standard now is 90%. If you meet 90% of your hours requirement for the year, then you are still certified with an accommodation, but you receive a 12.5% cut in your state aid grant award. So that means your state aid award goes down by 12.5%. If you also meet 90% of your hours, so if you meet 90% of one and 100% of the other, you get a 12.5% reduction. If you meet 90% of both, so neither 100%, both at 90%, you get a 25% reduction in your state aid award. So it does have a significant effect on your state aid grant award, but it does allow you to still remain certified. If you are doing the math at the end of the year and you come up at like 89% of hours or 89% of materials expenditures, you at that point cannot apply for state aid and will lose certification. We do not allow towns to drop below 90% of either of those requirements. And if you do drop below 90%, state aid is not an option for you and you are decertified. The way this works, as we all know, is like this fall, you will be applying with your FY27 budget, but with your FY26 statistics and spending. So this fall, if you are putting together your stated application and by early October, and you notice that your hours or materials are at 89% or lower, please send us an email really quickly because we can help you work with your materials to make sure you haven't missed anything because there are a lot of little things that people miss that could push you up above 90%. Hours is different. We obviously can't find hours on a calendar, but materials we can usually help with. But basically in the fall, when you are applying for state aid, if you are at 89% or lower of either of those, you'll have to let us know. And then at the November 2026 meeting, we will inform the commissioners that this municipality did not meet these regulations, these requirements. They are now decertified as of November 2026 for the whole fiscal year. So it's a big deal. Those are really important things to meet, the hours and the materials. Again, if you feel like you're running low on either of those, please email us because we don't want anybody to have to leave the program because they didn't meet these levels. So that's accommodations. Again, it's automatic. You don't have to apply for it. It just shows up on your application, but please reach out to us sooner rather than later if you're going to have a hard time meeting either of these requirements at least 90%. And
One
feel free to
thing
add
to,
anything, Jen.
oh, sorry.
No, I
Kate,
was
were you
just feel free to add anything.
Oh yeah. One thing I meant to mention up in the material, the hours open is that the hours open requirement is based on 38 consecutive weeks. So you can't just be open what is required on the day you apply. It has to be, for almost the whole year prior. Um, it's 38 consecutive weeks. It used to be that it was from September to May. And now it's any consecutive 38 weeks because some libraries are busier in the summertime than they are in the winter, so they reduce their hours in the winter. And some libraries are busier in the winter, and so they reduce their hours in the summer. And that's fine with us as long as you have met your requirement for 38 weeks. Then the final set of minimum required standards is that non-resident borrowing report. And you are required to lend materials to residents in other municipalities. We include an offset to help with this cost, and it is based on every physical item circulated over a service desk. So it doesn't count renewals, it doesn't count digital items, ebooks, anything like that. But if someone comes into your library from another town or city and borrows something over the desk and talks to one of your people, you'll get a small offset for that. And I think last year it was 15 cents an item. It's not a ton of money, but for those communities that are like tourist communities, they might get a big chunk when they lend to people from other places. So that's one of those three chunks of grant money that you'll get. You report this information to us on the ARIS, that annual report info survey. And we'll talk about that in more detail soon. The third piece of training, so the first was about the municipal appropriation requirement. The second was about the minimum standards. And now we're on to your annual reports and application. So how you get your money. So we're going to talk about your annual report information survey. That's the ARIS. You'll get to know that acronym really well. The financial report, state aid application and compliance form, and this process is all in statute, so these are required. So for the annual report information survey, the ARIS, that opens on July 1st each year. And then the signature page, and you submit that by um, the end of August. I think that date is wrong. So it's due, I think, August 15th-ish, mid-August. We do trainings over the summer. We'll start trainings in June, maybe earlier than that this year because we have a new vendor and we have to, do probably additional trainings, but I'm not, sometime either in late May or June, we'll start training for the ARIS. We'll do those trainings. Much of the information you can get from your network. So I saw quickly, I know CW Mars was represented on the call, and I think um, I don't know. So we have 8 networks, and so a lot the networks give you a lot of the information. Each network does it completely. They each do it very differently. Um, Most of the statistics that you report to us in the ARIS are then reported up to the IMLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services for the Public Libraries Survey. That is part of my job. That's actually something I'm working on right now. Once we get everybody certified, then I send the stats up to the feds. The statistics are also reported on our website and are frequently referenced. So we collect the ARIS collects information on salaries, positions, and education level of the people who work at the library, your holdings numbers, your circulation numbers, services, and your non-resident circulation. I didn't put programming in there, but programming is also in there. Whoops, sorry, let me go back. The statistics are reporting on the MBLC website. A lot of people look at those. Reporters look at those. Municipal leaders look at those. Patrons look at those. So the statistics that you report for us for state aid is public information and it is on our website. When we do the trainings that will start in May or June, I'll walk through our website and show you where everything is so you are familiar with that. But um, if you'd like, you can find the statistics now. Oops. Okay, did you want to do the financial report?
Yeah. Financial report. So this is the second report. ARIS's first financial report is second. It usually opens in August, so there usually is about a week when both ARIS and financial reports are open, and it's very exciting for everyone. This one is due the first Friday in October and is the report, plus also the state aid application and compliance form, which also have to be signed by your trustees. We will hold trainings in August and September, and as most people know, we're switching companies this year. We used to have Baker and Taylor, and now we're switching to a different company called LibPass through Accounting Opinions. So we will have lots of very in-depth required trainings this year for the surveys. So this is not a balance sheet. What this does is this tells us what money you're taking in as income, but totally separate from what money you're spending. Because we don't expect things to zero out, which is how some people look at this like normal, like balancing your checkbook. This is not balancing your checkbook. This is telling us separately how much money you're taking in from your town, from grants, from your friends, from your foundation, how much money you're taking in, and then break how much money you're spending then on not based on how much town money you're spending or how much friends money necessarily. It's how much you're spending on electricity and materials for our requirements and programming. It is so those two things are separate. That's an important thing. People email us all the time. They're like, I don't understand. Like, there's no place to show that it zeroes out. But if I'm saving money, this is not the point of this. The point is to know your income and your expenses. So the expenditures that we ask you to track are personnel, how much you spend on staff, how much you spend on benefits, and then also how much your town spends on benefits and personnel. And again, I'll go all into this in the training. How many materials, how much you spend on materials, which is part of the application for state aid, that's your materials expenditure requirement. And then how much you spend on different types of materials, so kids' books versus adult books versus ebooks, stuff like that. Other operating expenses, so elevator or maintenance or grounds or processing or all that kind of stuff. And then other capital. So we want to know if you have made any capital improvements during the year. On your elevator, for example, my elevator broke a lot, so it's always on my mind. But again, does not have to even out. It's not a balance sheet. We're not also tracking you. Like we're not going to go and be like, well, last year, we see that they took in $300,000 in grants, but only spent 200,000 of it. We're not looking at those numbers. The numbers that we're really looking at are how much you got from your municipality, for your FY27 budget, because that's the most important for the MAR. And we're looking at how much you spent on materials. Those are the two numbers that we're really going to look closely at and go back to you with questions about if the numbers aren't quite adding up. But the other stuff is so we have these statistics and also for your own personal use that you can go back and reference them. Did you want to add anything, Jen?
Nope.
Okay,
I guess I'll do this one.
sure.
So when you were doing your financial report, we call that your state aid. So you're doing your ARIS, that's earlier, and then your financial report and your state aid application are kind of in one. So your state aid application and your compliance form, it's submitted in October as part of the financial form. So it will be required always on the first Friday of October. These are official government forms. They are acknowledging that you've met all of the requirements, hours open, materials, your director requirements, like it will pull out your certification number, um, it and your TAMI, your total appropriated municipal income, so what you got from your municipality. It also will give you the numbers you need for your MAR for the next year. One thing we require when you submit your state aid application is that you send us official budget documentations from your municipality, and that budget documentation has to match what you say you got. And we'll review that during training, but we need something like a town meeting warrant, or a city finance document, something official from your town, and it has to match your appropriation. The commissioners meet in November, December, January, and February to certify those municipalities, like I mentioned earlier. We say all of these libraries have met their requirements, and here's what they're getting for state aid, and they certify them. The state aid awards are sent to the municipality at two times. The first installment will be sent within 2 weeks of certification, and the second installment will be sent in late March, early April. We don't get all of the money from the state at the beginning of the year. So we get it, we get the first part of it, we send you the first part of it. We get the second part of it, we send you the first part of it. I don't say half because it's not necessarily going to be an equal distribution. What you get in the fall or winter could be a little bit different than what you get in the spring. A lot depends on you know, how much. Like the number changes pretty much based on that NRC number, the non-resident circulation. The state aid awards are sent to the municipality, and it's electronically sent to your town or your city. It does not go to the library, but it is for the library to spend. And our last slide is to talk about how you can spend those state aid funds. So I think in general, it's anything that's for the benefiting the user of the library. So it can't be used for like gifts for retiring trustees. I had that happen once. You can't use it as I'm starting in the right column here just because I think it's easier to rid of some of the things you can't do. You can't use it as seed money to set up a foundation. You can't skip procurement laws. So like if you want to have a construction project and you don't want to have bids because, your friend is a construction person and they'll do a good job, you can't just use state aid money for that. It is still we have to follow all procurement laws, and it can't be used as a revenue source for the municipality. So just keep that in mind when they come to you and ask you if you would mind using state aid. You can certainly use state aid for, if you have too many electrical bills or whatever, but obviously that's not ideal. You want the town or city to pay for their share. Cate, do you want to talk about some of the, like, we don't have a final list. Like, if you have a question, you can send us questions and we'll give you our advice. But there's no way to tell exactly what it's for. But we have some examples here that might be useful for you.
Yeah, so the yes column.
Yeah.
So saving for construction project is a really common one. So the state aid is supposed to get deposited by the town in a separate account just for the library use. It doesn't go into like the general fund or the general coffer or into your budget. It goes into a separate state aid account that rolls over every year. So saving for a construction project or any future project is totally fine. The town does get to take any interest earned on the account every year, but the money is in an account for you to spend at your discretion. So as Jen mentioned, sometimes towns go to libraries and say like, hey, your budget's short. We're going to spend your state aid on staffing for next year to make up for that. It is not the town's decision on what to spend state aid on. The budget language says without further appropriation, and appropriation means the town deciding what to spend it on. You can, of course, decide to spend it on something to kind of help the town out if you're in that state of mind or if that's necessary, but the town does not get to decide. So saving for a future construction project is totally legit. As an aside, I will suggest if you, for anyone that's receiving state aid, but especially if you have a lot of money kind of accruing in your state aid account, it's really common for towns then to look at that account and say like, looks kind of like a slush fund that we can just dip into. It's just kind of this random money sitting in the library's account. Why are they asking us for a bigger budget? They just keep growing this random side grant account. Why aren't they spending that? What we suggest doing is at the beginning of fiscal year, calendar year, whatever works for you, kind of get on the record what your state aid will be spent on and what it's being saved for. So there's a record in your trustees minutes of the trustees and you saying, okay, this $100,000 in our account, it's not just sitting there for a rainy day. There are plans for it. I plan on saving 50,000 for construction, spending 25,000 on materials and 10,000 on this and this or whatever. So there's a record of what you're planning on spending it for. And if the town then comes to you and says, hey, we'd like to dip into your state aid money for something, you can fight back and say, no, these are earmarked for things already. These are already things in motion. So if you're saving for a construction program, make sure that's on the record with your trustees that that money is sitting there for a purpose. A lot of libraries use it on programming. I don't know many libraries that get programming line items from their town. So programming is, I would say, probably the most common thing libraries spend it on. Staff training is totally legit, whether you're bringing an outside trainer or professional development stuff online, totally fine. Buying materials, obviously, that's what, as Jen mentioned, a lot of libraries spend it on. So augmenting the operating budget, but not offsetting it. That's like, it's the end of the fiscal year and you've spent down your town item line for electricity because prices are high. You can use state aid to pay the end of the budget year on that to kind of finish that off. Um, Purchasing technology, pretty obvious. You can use it to purchase any technology for staff or for patrons. And then incentives and supplies for programming. So that's prizes, that's craft supplies, that's, summer reading prizes, that's any
Food.
craft supplies you need.
You can use food. You can use it for food.
Absolutely.
You
Yep.
can use it for food for staff training, but you can't use it to take your staff out for lunch. But if you do a
Yes.
professional development thing, you can have, you can use it for catering and stuff like that. One thing we didn't put on here specifically, is you can use it for staffing, but we warn you that if you do that, that's going to set a sort of precedent for the town. And so what we recommend is that if you want to call something a pilot program, like you want to see what happens if you're open on Sundays, you could say we're going to do a 6 month trial of um what it would cost and what the numbers would be if we were open on Sundays. And when you do that, you want to talk about that expense would then be a municipal expense. Staffing is a municipal expense. We see this happen a lot. It just happened with a library who is facing a cut, and they're like, "Well, you've always just used it for this." And she's like, "Yeah, what? But that was for 1 year. Like we agreed this was going to be 1 year." And they're like, "But you've got the money." So just, yes, you can. And we also get another one about municipalities will ask the library to use it to cover if somebody retires and they have like sick leave and vacation leave accumulated, but that wasn't appropriated, that is okay. You know, it'd be nice if the town would cover that, but if they can't, you can use it. You can use state aid for that. The town accountant or the municipal accountant doesn't get to veto the library's decision, but you know, there's relationship building that has to happen, and the trustees are the ones who are authorizing these purchases or giving the director permission to spend that state aid money. And we are at the end, so I'm going to stop the recording. If I can get this floating thing to come down. Give me just 1 second.